This is the story of an invention that transformed human communication, but sadly destroyed the lives of most of the men who made it possible. For centuries, paper was made one sheet at a time by hand. It was slow, labor-intensive, and limited. Then, at the turn of the 19th century, a machine appeared that changed everything. Pulp went in at one end, and endless sheets of paper rolled out the other. The Fourdrinier machine didn't just improve paper making, it made mass communication possible. But the man behind it paid a terrible price. Hi everyone, my name is Joey. Welcome to Studio Joey. Our story begins in France at the close of the 18th century when the nation was in upheaval. While the French Revolution was raging in Paris, a young man named Louis-Nicolas Robert was quietly working at a paper mill in Essen, just outside the city. The mill, owned by Saint-Léger Didot, a member of the famous Didot printing family, was one of the largest and most progressive in France. It employed 300 workers and supplied paper to the Ministry of Finance for currency production. Robert had once been a soldier, serving in the military for roughly a decade. Now, he serves as a clerk and overseer at the mill, keeping records, managing supplies, and supervising workers. From his vantage point, he saw the whole paper-making process every single day. And honestly, it bothered him, not because the workers were failing, but because the system itself was. The revolution had unleashed a flood of newspapers, pamphlets, and government decrees. Demand for paper was exploding, but production was still medieval. Here's what he saw day after day. A worker called a vatman dipping a wire mold into pulp, shaking it, and then passing it to the next guy called the coucher, who transfers the wet sheet to a felt, which is then taken by another worker called the layman, who hangs it to dry. As I mentioned earlier, the process was slow, labor-intensive, and as Robert rightfully observed, totally outdated for what France needed at the time. To make it worse, the workers lacked discipline and constantly fought. Robert thought, there has to be a better way. What if a machine could do this instead? Faster, cheaper, and without all the drama. Later in his patent application, Robert basically admitted, I dreamt of making paper in endless sheets without workers, just machines. His light bulb moment came while watching pulp settle on the mold. He thought, what if the mold didn't stay still? What if it moved like a belt? Then the pulp could just keep flowing and you'd get an endless ribbon of paper. Genius idea, but here's the problem. Genius doesn't build machines. Robert had no money, no tools, no workshop. Luckily, his employer, Saint-Léger Didot, believed in him and backed his experiments, providing him with money, materials, and space to experiment. So Robert tinkered for years. He used scraps of wire, rollers, and wood, and built prototype after prototype. Most of them failed. Some were barely better than hand paper making. He was ready to give up more than once, but Didot pushed him to keep going. Finally, in 1798, Robert built a working model. For the first time ever, a machine made a continuous sheet of paper. It was fragile, it wasn't commercially ready, but it worked. And just like that, paper making had stepped into the industrial age. Louis-Nicolas Robert and Saint-Léger Didot filed for a patent together in 1798, and by January 1799, the patent was granted in Robert's name. For Robert, this felt like a breakthrough, but not a victory yet. He wasn't expecting instant wealth. What he wanted was backing, money, materials, and time to finish what he started. But almost immediately, tensions surfaced over a simple question with no simple answer. Who actually owned the invention? Robert argued it was his creation, his design, his hands, his patent. Didot countered that without his mill, his workers, and his financial support, the machine would never have existed beyond sketches and experiments. Honestly, they both had a point. Robert supplied the ingenuity, Didot supplied the infrastructure, and neither man seems to have entered the arrangement expecting betrayal. But beneath their disagreement lay a deeper problem. France's economy was deeply unstable. The revolutionary government had flooded the country with paper money called assignats, and by the late 1790s, inflation had hollowed out their value. Cash was scarce, credit was fragile, and even wealthy industrialists like Didot found themselves rich in land and influence but short on liquid funds. Against this backdrop, Robert made a critical decision. Needing money to continue developing the machine and lacking any other patron, he sold the rights to the patent along with the working prototype to Didot for a substantial sum on paper to be paid in installments. For Robert, this wasn't cashing out, it was buying time. Importantly, Didot did make an initial payment. With that money, Robert left Didot's mill and set up a small workshop of his own, an attempt to regain independence and keep improving the machine. But the limits quickly became clear. Robert had talent, but he lacked capital, skilled mechanics, large-scale testing facilities, and political backing. His workshop could produce incremental refinements, but not the industrial leap the machine required. Meanwhile, Didot's financial situation worsened. His mill was struggling. Paper was in demand, but payments were unreliable, and he had already sunk funds into Robert's work. So, unfortunately, he couldn't make his remaining payments to Robert. What had begun as a financing arrangement collapsed into a dispute. Robert, unpaid and sidelined, took the matter to court. In 1801, the judges ruled in his favor, restoring the French patent to him. Legally, he had won. Practically, he had nothing to show for it. So for a brief moment, it seemed justice had prevailed. But by then, the real future of the machine was already slipping out of France and out of Robert's hands. Robert got his patent back, but in France, that legal victory meant very little. A patent is only as valuable as the money and machinery behind it. And Robert had neither. No capital, no factory, no investors. And in post-revolutionary France, those things were almost impossible to come by. Credit was broken, industry was fragile, and even established manufacturers were barely staying afloat. Didot understood what this meant. If the machine had a future, it probably wasn't in France. Across the Channel, Britain was in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. Capital flowed more freely, investors were willing to gamble on new machines, and paper making, still limited by hand production, was ripe for disruption. If the invention was going to survive, it would have to become English. For Robert, that meant watching his idea live on under someone else's name. And here, Didot had an advantage that Robert did not. His brother-in-law, Jean Gamble, was English, with established business ties in London. That mattered because British patents were easier to secure and easier to monetize through local intermediaries. Sometime around 1800, before Robert's legal dispute was fully resolved, the machine's design and concept were carried to England through Gamble. By modern standards, this would look questionable, but at the time, patent rights ended at national borders and inventions were often repatented abroad. Once this happened, the center of gravity shifted. In 1801, Gamble secured a British patent for the continuous paper-making machine, closely based on Robert's invention, but now legally anchored in Britain. From that point forward, development moved ahead without Robert's involvement. But Gamble lacked both engineering expertise and deep pockets. To move the project forward, he turned to two London paper merchants with money, ambition, and a willingness to take enormous risks, the Fourdrinier brothers, Henry and Sealy. Convinced the machine could revolutionize paper making, the Fourdrinier brothers agreed to finance its development, taking a controlling share of the rights. They didn't just invest profits from their business, They staked much of their personal fortune on it. And they weren't speculating. They were convinced they were building the future. To make the machine truly work, they hired Bryan Donkin, one of the most talented mechanical engineers of the era. Robert's original machine was a breakthrough. It could form a continuous wet sheet of paper, but it still depended on hand labor to lift, press, and dry that fragile sheet. It was ingenious but incomplete. Over the next several years, Donkin transformed it. He introduced pressing rollers to remove water mechanically. Steam-heated drying cylinders allowed the paper to dry continuously as it moved. Endless felts carried the sheet safely through each stage without tearing. Piece by piece, the machine became faster, stronger, and truly industrial. By 1807, the Fourdrinier machine was producing continuous paper reliably, smoother, more uniform, and far faster than anything made by hand. A single machine could now do the work of dozens of batmen. The age of handmade paper wasn't instantly over, but its dominance was. The machine spread across Britain, Europe, and eventually the world. Paper became cheaper, more abundant, and more powerful than ever before. The Fourdrinier machine was a technical masterpiece, but for Henry and Sealy Fourdrinier, it became a financial disaster. Believing they stood at the edge of a fortune, the brothers poured extraordinary sums into the project, more than £60,000 of their own money over the years, a staggering investment by early 19th century standards, equal to millions in today's money. They trusted that patents would protect them, but the reality was brutal. Poorly worded protections and rapid imitation by competitors allowed rival manufacturers to build similar machines without paying to Fourdriniers a penny. The brothers borrowed heavily to keep going, convinced that success was just one improvement away. Instead, they were dragged into years of litigation, mounting debt, and financial collapse. By the time Parliament granted them £7,000 in compensation in 1840, it barely dented what they had lost. The irony was unmistakable. The machine that bore their name was transforming paper production across the world, while its financiers were ruined by it. The brothers were not alone in their suffering. For almost everyone else connected to the machine's development, it was a story not of reward, but of ruin. The invention changed the world, but it left behind a trail of broken men. The Fourdriniers, once prosperous London stationers, were stripped of the security that years of honest trade had earned them. Their hopes of riches dissolved into endless lawsuits and mounting debt. None of them lived to see how completely the machine would reshape the world. When the end came, Sealy, the younger brother, died first in 1847 at the age of 74, bankrupt and financially ruined. Henry outlived him by 7 years but suffered even more. He was briefly confined to debtor's prison and died in 1854, his fortune gone. John Gamble, who had helped carry the invention to England and secured the first British patent, played a crucial early role, but he lacked the engineering skill and capital to take the project further. Once the Fourdrinier brothers and Bryan Donkin took over development, Gamble faded from the story. His contribution essential, but fleeting. Louis-Nicolas Robert, the original inventor, suffered perhaps the most bitter fate. Exhausted by years of legal disputes and financial strain, he eventually abandoned papermaking altogether. He moved to the countryside, where he ran a small school and spent his later years in modest circumstances. By the time the fully developed paper machine returned to France, Robert no longer had any claim to it. Only the knowledge that the idea he had once imagined now powered an industry he would never benefit from. He died in 1828 at the age of 66, largely forgotten. Saint-Léger Didot also paid a heavy price. The economic turmoil of the era and the collapse of credit drained his resources. He lost control of his mill and died in 1829 at the age of 61. His hopes for the machine securing his business unrealized. Bryan Donkin was the only one to achieve financial success from the invention, though he never became extravagantly wealthy. Methodical and industrious, he transformed Robert's fragile model into a robust industrial engine and founded one of the great engineering firms of the age. By 1851, his company had produced nearly 200 machines installed across Britain, Europe, and beyond. Donkin lived to see his work celebrated at the height of the Industrial Revolution, prosperous and honored, a rare success story among the men who had built the Fourdrinier machine. Despite the bitter fate of most of the men behind it, the Fourdrinier machine changed the world. For the first time in history, paper could be made on an industrial scale. Newspapers multiplied, carrying news across borders and continents. Books grew cheaper, spreading literacy to millions. Bureaucracies expanded, powered by the steady flow of paper records, and packaging and printing industries flourished. And here's the wild part. More than 200 years later, modern paper mills still use the same basic design. A stream of pulp, drained, pressed, and dried into endless sheets. The Fourdrinier machine remains one of the great engines of human progress, but most of the men behind it never shared in the abundance it produced. The story of the Fourdrinier machine is proof that progress is never free. Invention can change the world, but it doesn't guarantee success for its inventor. The Fourdrinier brothers and their peers gave us the foundation of mass communication, yet most of them paid for it with their fortunes, their health, and in some cases, their freedom. Their story is a cautionary tale. Ambition can drive invention, but it can also demand a price far greater than the reward. So let me leave you with this. If you had an idea that could change the world but might ruin you in the process, would you still chase it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.